Hey everyone, welcome back. My name is Mac, and today we're talking about the complete Elemental Shaman guide for patch 12.0. I've been holding off making this video because I've been waiting for the tuning notes to make sure that nothing crazy changes in Elemental, but given the season just started and Blizzard just effectively decided Elemental isn't worth tuning right now, I'm not gonna wait any longer. Hey, Mac from the future here. Literally the same day I recorded this video, that night, Blizzard decided to add Elemental to the tuning passes, so we actually got a 10% buff on our Chain Lightning and Earthquake. I'm very prepared for this impromptu recording session, as you can tell. But, good job, Blizzard. I'm gonna walk on, enjoy the video. So we're going to talk about how Elemental Shaman actually works, Farseer versus Stormbringer, your builds and rotations for different types of content, and a lot of other stuff that tends to trip people up when they're learning the spec or just trying to improve their gameplay. And just as a quick disclaimer, Blizzard has already said that there's more tuning planned, so this could all definitely change in the future. So if you want the most up-to-date version as the season goes on, make sure to subscribe and join the Discord as well, because I'll be keeping up with all the changes in there as well. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into the Elemental core mechanics. At its core, Elemental is a spec built around two main focuses, Maelstrom management and cooldown usage. A lot of playing the spec well comes down to building and spending Maelstrom efficiently while making sure you're getting good value out of your cooldowns. Elemental is a very heavily cooldown reliant spec, more so than others, so when your cooldown usage is good, the spec feels great, and when it's not so good, the spec can start to feel a lot worse pretty quickly. Farseer and Stormbringer both keep that core identity, but they do change how the spec generally feels to play. Farseer, in my opinion, is the beginner option. If you're just learning Elemental or struggle with movement, Farseer is a good choice to get comfortable with the spec before you move into Stormbringer. It's easy to execute and generally gives you a much more consistent damage profile, as well as the fact that it's significantly less punishing when you make a mistake. Stormbringer, on the other hand, is the stronger option overall in most scenarios. It has a higher damage ceiling, better sustained AoE, and generally has more upside if you're trying to optimize in harder content. The trade-off, however, is it has a much more spiky damage profile and is significantly more punishing, particularly in heavy movement. As for the class talent tree, Elemental Shaman has a lot of utility, which is one of the nice things about the spec. This is my base talent tree, and from here I pretty much have 2 points to work with, depending upon the dungeon or the situation I'm running. If I really need a third point to play around with, I tend to take one out of Winds of Alakir, but I'm usually trying not to do that. A lot of the class tree is pretty much spoken for already, so there's not a ton of freedom there, but we do usually have a little bit of wiggle room with our utility choices. Some of those options are things like Windrush Totem for group movement speed, Ascending Air to lower Windrush's cooldown, Earthgrab Totem for AoE immobilization, Hex for hard single target CC, Static Charge to reduce the cooldown of your Capacitor Totem, or a personal favorite of mine, Frost Shock. Frost Shock is by no means a standard pickup, but I like to have it just because it gives me something to do while moving if I don't have a Lava Surge proc, plus it's a little bit of a muscle memory I have from last season when we were running it. So overall, the tree does not have a ton of open space, but the little bit of flexibility you do have is mostly there for utility, and this is something that you should be adjusting based upon the content you're running. Now for talents. In solo content, this is the only time I would really recommend Farseer. It's generally more survivable, gives you more on-demand healing, and has a shorter burst window with more consistent damage profile overall. This consistency makes it much better fit for solo content, where survivability and consistency matter much more than chasing the highest possible damage. Between Ancestral Swiftness being a 30-second cooldown and Voltaic Blaze with Purging Flames buff being a 10-second cooldown, you end up with much more frequent access to your mini burst windows. This makes the spec feel smoother in solo content and also helps cover one of Elemental's weakest points, being low target cleave. Not only that, but it's also significantly more mobile, having more instant cast than Stormbringer, which is super important when you're at risk at taking a bunch of melee swings. When it comes to raid and single target, this is where we're going to move into Stormbringer. Here, we drop Voltaic Blaze and instead pick up Power of the Maelstrom, Fusion of the Elements, and Master the Elements for Lava Weaving. Power of the Maelstrom gives you extra spell overloads, which is nice to boost your overall damage, but more importantly, it's a required node for Fusion of the Elements, which gives you a free Elemental Blast, which is really valuable for both your buff upkeep and your overall single target damage. But the real change here is Master of the Elements. This helps empower our hardest hitting abilities like Tempest and Elemental Blast, and allows us to make really good use of the classic lava weaving style that most veteran Elemental players are already accustomed to. It is significantly less mobile, but given how much damage it can deal when played properly, I really cannot suggest Farseer in any scenario aside from an incredibly heavy movement fight. For Mythic Plus, this build looks pretty similar to the raid setup, but we're going to swap a few talents around to push more of our power into AoE. Instead of Master of the Elements, Fusion of the Elements, and Power of the Maelstrom, we're instead going to pick up Voltaic Blaze, Inferno Arc, and Charged Conduit. Voltaic Blaze is taken for the easy Flame Shock upkeep and spread, purely because of the Inferno Arc talent working really well with it. Inferno Arc effectively gives us a 10% damage buff to enemies afflicted with Flame Shock, which makes the instant 6 Flame Shocks from Voltaic Blaze super impactful for effectively very little investment. And then Charged Conduit increases the damage bonus of our Lightning Rod by 25%, and it extends its duration by 4 seconds, which makes Lightning Rod spread much easier and a lot more consistent in larger AoE scenarios. Since it's lacking the Master of the Elements like the Raid build, the difficulty instead shifts to proper Lightning Rod management instead of Lava Weaving. But now that we've covered the builds, let's go ahead and move into the rotations, starting with Delves and solo content. I'm just going to focus on the basic rotation here and go over cooldown usage in more detail a bit later, but for now, the general rule of thumb is that you generally want to send your Ascendants as often as possible. Now, for single target in Delves and solo content, the rotation is pretty straightforward. Cast Stormkeeper and Ancestral Swiftness on cooldown, spend Maelstrom with Earth Shock, maintain Flame Shock, cast Lava Burst, and then fill with Lightning Bolt. There really isn't much nuance here like there is in the Raid build, it's really just a simple priority list. For Cleave or AoE, the rotation is nearly identical with a few minor changes. Just like single target, you cast Stormkeeper and Ancestral Swiftness on cooldown, only we swap our Earth Shock for Earthquake, send Voltaic Blaze on cooldown, and swap out Lightning Bolt for Chain Lightning. The main thing to understand with this build is that your mini burst windows are really Stormkeeper and Ancestral Swiftness. Since both of these summon your grandmas and grandpas, you want to use those early and often so you get the most value possible out of them when you're in fights that might not be as long. Now the Raid single target Stormbringer build is where the rotation starts to really feel a bit more fluid and a little less like a strict step-by-step priority list. The main reason for this is because the build is really built around properly consuming your Master of the Elements buff. So instead of thinking about this like a fixed rotation, it's better to think about it as a priority system where you're weaving Lava Burst in between your main spells in order to empower the right buttons. For more specific in-detail information about why I'm choosing the buttons to buff, I did make a Master of the Elements specific video I linked in the description that you can check out after this one if you're interested. But the short version is that Tempest is your #1 priority to empower, followed by Elemental Blast, and then followed by Lightning Bolt. Now for pure single target, your priority is Stormkeeper on cooldown, maintain Flame Shock, Tempest, Elemental Blast, Lava Burst if you have 2 charges, and then Lightning Bolt. In AoE or Cleave, it's the exact same idea, you're just swapping Lightning Bolt for Chain Lightning, and if there are 4 more targets and you can make use of it, Elemental Blast for Earthquake. Quick note here, with Master of the Elements, you're going to have some buffs that you just cannot realistically send on a Tempest or Elemental Blast in time, and that is completely fine. If that happens, it is totally okay to send those buffs on Lightning Bolt instead. But ideally what you want to do is you want to try to maintain 1 Lava Burst as often as possible, so whenever you get that Tempest proc, or have enough Maelstrom to send an Elemental Blast, you're ready to empower it with Master of the Elements. The rotation isn't hard because the button list is complicated, it's hard because you're trying to get the most out of your Lava Burst charges in those empowered casts. Now in Mythic Plus, the rotation is actually pretty simplistic compared to the Raid build, since we're no longer playing around Master of the Elements. The difficulty here, like I mentioned earlier, isn't the rotation, but rather the spreading and managing of your Lightning Rod. It might sound minimal, but proper targeting is really what separates a good elemental player from a great one in keys. As far as the rotation is concerned, in single target, we're sending Stormkeeper on cooldown, spending with Elemental Blast, maintaining Flame Shock with Voltaic Blaze, casting Lava Burst without ever overcapping on 2 charges, and then using Tempest and Lightning Bolt as filler. The AoE rotation is pretty much the same thing, only we're removing Lava Burst and only casting Earthquake on 4 or more targets, and replacing Lightning Bolt with Chain Lightning. So it's Stormkeeper on cooldown, maintain Flame Shock with Voltaic Blaze, spend with Earthquake on 4 or more targets, or Elemental Blast with 3 or less targets, and then use Tempest or Chain Lightning as filler. When it comes to Lightning Rod spread, Earthquake is really going to be doing the majority of your work here, but using Tempest to spread that Lightning Rod can be really important and significant damage over the course of an entire dungeon. The only time this becomes more important, and I ignore it, is when there is a priority target that needs to go down as fast as possible. Since Tempest does pretty significant single target damage, it's better to, in those situations, send it on the priority target instead of trying to force extra Lightning Rod spread. And one final thing I want to mention about Lightning Rod is a strange interaction with Tempest and Earthquake. If you cast Tempest on a target and then immediately follow it up with an Earthquake without swapping targets, you're only going to get 1 Lightning Rod out of that entire sequence when you should be getting 2. If you want to make sure 2 occur, you need to tab during that Tempest cast and then place the Earthquake on a different target. This is just one of those weird little elemental nuances. I'm not entirely sure why it works this way, I'm just assuming it's because Earthquake is instant while Tempest takes a moment to actually hit the target. So it sounds like a small optimization, but it's definitely something worth being aware of if you're trying to get the most out of the spec. Anyways, if you want more detailed explanations about these rotations in practice, I have linked another video specific to these in the description below for you to check out. Now I want to take a moment to just touch upon Nature Swiftness and Spirit Walker's Grades, because both of these are very important for dealing with movement on our class. Even though we do have these tools for movement, this is still a spec where a lot of our damage is tied to hard cast, so if movement catches you off guard, your damage can fall apart pretty quickly. Nature Swiftness is our oh shit button and one of our main ways we deal with that. It's on a 1 minute cooldown and makes your next spell instant, and most of the time you're going to want to use it on something important like an Elemental Blast or a Tempest. One of the smaller mistakes I see newer Elemental players making is holding Nature Swiftness forever waiting for this perfect moment to use it. It's actually much better to just use it a little imperfectly than to sit on it for too long and lose multiple casts over the course of a fight or a dungeon. Spirit Walker's Grace, on the other hand, is our bread and butter when dealing with heavy movement. It's on a 1.5 minute cooldown and lets you move while casting for 15 seconds, allowing you to damage through the mechanics that would normally prevent you from doing anything. So when you know a mechanic is coming out that's going to force a lot of movement, or you know you're going to need to reposition during an important damage window like your Ascendance, Spirit Walker's Grace lets you get around that without completely breaking down. This is super important to also consider during Ascendance, because the last thing you want is to commit your biggest cooldown and then lose a huge chunk of that time just because the fight forced you to move. So with both of these buttons, the idea is kind of the same. Try not to think of them so much as panic buttons, more so as uptime tools, even though Nature Swiftness kind of does turn into an oh shit button from time to time. As far as gearing goes, the stat priority is Mastery first, then Crit and Haste, and then Versatility after that. With our new Apex talents, we get a lot more value from Crit, which is why Crit and Haste are kind of in the same value there. I don't know the exact perfect numbers, but generally we want somewhere around 50% of our secondary stats going into Mastery, with the rest split into Haste and Crit. I didn't crunch the numbers here. I'm looking back to Hawk Corrigan, the main shaman guy from Wowhead. It says we should be aiming for around 1100 to 1200 Mastery before splitting the rest into Crit or Haste. That said, as always, you should sim your character if you want the best exact answer for your own gear, because your personal stat weights can absolutely shift depending upon what you're wearing. For crafted gear and embellishments, we can't really go wrong with either a weapon or the World Tender set, specifically the boots and the belt. The weapon is great, specifically early on, and can give us a boatload of int and secondary stats, and with the hunt embellishment, we get a good chunk of secondary stats as well. The World Tender set, though, is particularly nice as it similarly gives us a solid amount of secondary stats for 15 seconds, just like the embellishment we would put on our weapons. When it comes to crafting, personally, I tend to err on the side of caution and patience, generally waiting for my first myth vault to make sure I don't accidentally waste or craft option. Really though, you can't go wrong with either of them, it just depends on how patient you want to be. And for consumables, that's going to depend a bit on where your stats are. Early on, since we're going to be needing more mastery, you're going to want to run Flask of the Magisters and the Mastery enchants. Then, once you get closer to the 1200 mastery range, you're likely going to want to swap those consumables and enchants over to Crit and Haste instead, and the same applies to gems. As far as weapon abuse are concerned, I would suggest using Phoenix Oil instead of Flametongue weapon, even though Flametongue isn't picked up in our Raid or Mythic Plus builds. Now I want to talk a bit about Ascendance, because it's not just your most important cooldown, but using it properly plays a huge part in how successful you'll be with the spec. The spec can really live or die by how well you use Ascendance. It's probably the hardest part of the spec to get right, because while you want to send it as often as possible, you also need to be able to judge when you should hold it, which is really difficult to learn. Most of the time, the general rule of thumb is to send your cooldowns early and often, so you're getting as many as possible. But Ascendance is one of those cooldowns where you cannot just mindlessly press it on cooldown, because if you send it too late into a pack, into heavy movement, or into targets that are about to die, you're wasting a huge amount of your damage. At the same time, you don't want to overthink it and hold it forever waiting for the perfect moment, because that's another really easy way to lose a lot of damage over the course of a dungeon. So the real skill with Ascendance is learning when a pull is actually worth committing it to, or if it's better off waiting a few seconds for the next opportunity. But when you get that right, Ascendance feels amazing, and it's where the majority of our damage comes from. If you're new to Elemental Shaman, or just want more detailed information on how to use your cooldowns or Ascendance in general, I've linked another video in the description you can check out if you're interested. Now as far as defensives are concerned, Elemental is kind of in a weird space. We are actually pretty tanky baseline, but we do not have a lot of real defensive options. Astral Shift is our main defensive, giving us 40% DR on a 1.5 minute cooldown, and is really our only true damage reduction option. But once that's gone, your options are pretty limited. In fights or dungeons where damage is frequent or back-to-back, Elemental can definitely feel a bit rough. But while it's not ideal, we do sort of have a few pseudo-defensive options when we're really struggling. Firstly, Earth Elemental. This increases your max health by 15%, assuming you're talented into it, which you definitely should be, and can help you survive damage that Astral Shift isn't available for, even though it's not actual damage reduction. The other, and admittedly much less ideal option, is the Spirit Wolf talent. If you sit in Ghostwolf for a few seconds, you get a 5% stacking damage reduction every second up to 20%. So while it's incredibly frustrating to do, if you absolutely save something, it can save you in a pinch if you know damage is coming. Now before we wrap up, I want to go through a few quick questions that come up all the time in my Discord, so I'm just going to rapid fire these. Question 1, is Farseer really that bad compared to Stormbringer? The answer to that, unfortunately, is yes, at least if you're talking about Raid or Mythic Plus. Farseer is fine and definitely easier to play, but it is a pretty significant damage loss compared to Stormbringer in the content where damage actually matters the most. If your goal is easy movement or learning the spec, Farseer is totally fine, but if your goal is performance and raid or keys, Stormbringer is where you need to be. Second question, why play Elemental Blast and not Earthshock? This mostly just comes down to damage versus mobility. Elemental Blast just does more damage between the damage of the spell itself and the buffs that it gives you. Earthshock does less damage, but it can make the spec feel a lot more mobile, so if you're in a movement-heavy fight, it can definitely be a viable option. But in most situations, Elemental Blast is going to be better. Question 3, do I cast Lava Burst in Mythic Plus? In AoE, the answer is basically no. You are never really casting Lava Burst in AoE unless you need to move and get a Lava Surge proc, so you don't miss a global. The only exception to this rule is if for some reason you picked up Purging Flames, at which point you consume that Purging Flames buff with one Lava Surge proc. And lastly, question 4 is the most abstract, being, my damage is still bad, what am I doing wrong? Unfortunately, I can't know the answer to that unless I see you play or look at logs. And side note, if you want help with that, definitely join the Discord and I can try to help you out a bit there, as well as a bunch of other players. But generally, it's one of two things, and usually in this order. Firstly, you're using Ascendance improperly or inefficiently. And secondly, mobs are dying too quickly, which is more of a problem earlier on in the season in smaller keys where things just don't live long enough. But that's pretty much Elemental Shaman. Like I said throughout the guide, if you want any more specific details about Elemental, like the cooldown usage, rotations, or some other smaller topics, I've linked a bunch of those videos in the description below. If this video helped you out, I would really appreciate it if you subscribed and let me know your thoughts in the comments below, or join my Discord as well so you can talk to other Elemental enjoyers. But that's all I have for today, so thank you very much for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.